All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christine Ingram, the local interest librarian here at the New Hanover County Public Library. If you are watching the recorded session online, you will notice that we are not recording our speaker visually today. The lighting in this room is not ideal, but we are going to be sharing the slides and recording the audio. Today, we will learn about Abraham Galloway, a formerly enslaved person from Southport, North Carolina. Galloway, who escaped to Canada and moved back to North Carolina to become a state senator. He was a Union soldier and spy, abolitionist, and elected representative in his short life of 33 years. Our speaker this afternoon is Les Hewlett. Mr. Hewlett is a new member of the Brunswick County African American Heritage Commission and a member of the Senior Men's Club. As a lifelong lover of history, he recently welcomed the challenge of writing a series of short biographies detailing the lives of local African American figures. Mr. Hewlett, thank you.
Thank you. Well, add a little bit more. I am a native Wilmingtonian, born in James Walker Memorial Hospital. So I grew up in this area, and I grew up in the segregated school system. I didn't graduate until '63, and of course, it's 2 more years before segregation came to an end. But I've learned a lot. You know, I've lived elsewhere and moved around quite a bit with my career, and I knew I'd always come back to Wilmington because I've never lived anywhere that I like as much as I like Wilmington, and particularly Wilmington people. Yes, I don't know that there's a friendlier place on earth, not even Disney World. At any rate, because I did grow up in a segregated school system, we weren't taught that much about the blacks, the African Americans. And although I'm very, very proud of what Wilmingtonians have done in the past, it's always amazed me that with a city the size of Wilmington, which is not humongous, how many celebrities and very successful people that we've had to come to Wilmington. And more recently, I started thinking, well, a lot of those are African Americans. And so I started writing down the ones I could remember. And then I decided, well, I'm going to do a little bit of research and start writing a little biography of each one of them. Because when I was a kid, my mother, who actually worked for the library many, many years ago, she also started a church library at Masonburg Baptist Church where I was baptized. And so she taught me to read. And so I read a lot. And one of the first books I remember reading was a book called Faith Made Them Champions. And it was a series of short stories written by famous people who were celebrities. And it was written by Dr. Norman Vincent Peale. One of those was a story about Mickey Mantle, who was my boyhood hero, and I'm still a Yankees fan to this day. But that's the format I'm working on for this book, is to have very short biographies of each of the blacks, the African Americans that either were born here or spent a significant time of their formative years in Wilmington. And I want to write them in such a way that they're attractive, they're positive sounding. But in doing this research for the different people that I have, right now I've got 350 names. I've got to whittle that down. It keeps growing because the more research I do, I find others. And so I've got to hone in a little bit and stiffen up my criteria to get a manageable number. But right now it's like 40 to 50. But one of the first people that really impressed me when I started doing the research, and I'm doing it in chronological order, very earliest African American born in the Wilmington area, was David Walker. And he was born free. He was a free black. But number 2 was one I want to talk about today, and he's the one that just, there needs to be a movie made on his life. It's just unbelievable what he was able to do. Now, David Walker and Abraham Galloway both only lived to be 33 years old. And what they each got accomplished in that short amount of time is just amazing. So today we'll talk about Abraham Galloway. And whether you know about him or not, I hope that after this time this afternoon that you will know a little bit more about him and will appreciate what he was able to accomplish in his short time. He was born in Smithfield, North Carolina, which now is called Southport, North Carolina. It's not to be confused with Smithfield, which is further up the road, but he was born in 1837. Now, his father was a river pilot, Cape Fear River pilot, lived in Southport, where Southport, probably to this day, has river pilots that live there because they're right at the mouth of the river. It's very convenient for them to help guide the large ships up to Wilmington. But his father was John Wesley Galloway, who was a white river pilot. His mother was Hester Hankins. Now, Hester was owned by, as a young man, he's not wealthy. A lot of slave owners were not wealthy. He only had, I think, 2 servants, and Abraham and Abraham's mother. But the interesting thing about this, with the father being a white man, quite often in the South, that happened more often than not. But in this case, John Galloway did not abandon his family. He supported his son. He made sure that he got an education. He did not get a formal education, but he was trained as a mason. And he became a master mason. And once he reached his highest level as a mason, his owner decided to move the whole family up to Wilmington where he could make more money as a mason. And back then, urban slaves, as you would classify Abraham in this case, because it's in Wilmington now, he's not at the plantation. Most of our plantations along the Cape Fear were rice plantations. That was not a good life. Not that any life of a slave was good, but it's a little bit better as an urban slave, because once you're trained like Abraham was, and he's a master mason, Wilmington was growing like a weed back then, or like it is today. So his services were very much in demand, and urban slaves could work for someone else as long as they earned enough money, $180 per year, for their owner. They could work outside the home, for that matter. But due to Wilmington's growth, it was also attracting mainly German and Irish immigrants. And they were also, a lot of those were also Masons. So Abraham saw competition was increasing in Wilmington. And he had a friend who I believe, it's Richard Eden, I think he was, if I remember correctly, I believe he was a barber. And he was married. And I don't know what he did with his wife, but both of them decided they were going to flee slavery. So what they did, they stowed away on a schooner headed towards Philadelphia. Back then, this is looks like a watercolor drawing of Wilmington, downtown Wilmington back then. And this is sort of probably from the area of the battleship, looking across the river. You see all the sailing vessels. Back then, Wilmington was the largest naval stores port in the world. The English Navy, which had probably more sailing ships than anybody else, this is where North Carolina is where they got their mast and their turpentine and everything they needed for naval stores. They depended on Wilmington, and to a lesser degree, I think Maine had a lot of pine trees. The British got there too. But at any rate, the ports were right there downtown, not downriver like they are today. So he and Richard are on to get down in the hold of this ship that's sailing to Philadelphia. And somehow or other, they were not discovered. Usually, stowaways were so frequent that before the ship would leave port, they could do a search of the hold, and it had to be visible because of the smell. If you're down in the hold with all the turpentine, pine smells good, but it can be overwhelming, especially if it's hot or cold down in the hold of the river. And they made it to Philadelphia. The ship was not searched, so they think they either paid off the captain or the captain was an abolitionist himself and sort of looked the other way. But they made it to Philadelphia, and meeting them in Philadelphia was the abolitionist William Still, and he was one of the most successful black businessmen in the U.S. And he provided, we met them both in Philadelphia, he provided them with tickets on the Underground Railroad, and they were able to escape to Kingston, Ontario. And those of you that are not Canadian, which is probably most of us, this is Ontario. This area right here is Michigan. Detroit is right here, just across the Detroit River from Windsor, Ontario. I went to Detroit on business several years ago, and we stayed in Windsor. That's before 9/11, so it was really easy to get across the border. Kingston is up here, it's even further north. This would be New York State. And so they finally made it to freedom. Now, if they had stayed in the north, Congress had passed a law that if a slave, an escaped slave, is captured in the north, in a non-slave area, but in the United States, they have to be taken sent back to their owner. So he's not safe, even in the north. Canada, on the other hand, banned all of that. So if they made it to Canada, they were safe. They were not going to be extradited back to their owner. But apparently Abraham didn't like the cold weather or something, but he was not content. He immediately started traveling into New York, New England, Ohio, coming back into the U.S., risking his own life. But he started giving speeches. And this guy never learned to read or write, but he was apparently an excellent orator. And he became a very ardent abolitionist, and that's all he preached and taught about. Is he traveled all over the northern United States. And we're approaching now, we're not yet in Civil War times, but we're approaching that time period. But it's part of his speaking, or in addition to his speaking, he goes to Boston and he gets on a ship and sails to Haiti. Because back then they were looking, the abolitionists were looking at several different options as to how they could actually free the slaves and what they could get them, where they could get them to get away from the perils of slavery. So they were looking at one of the possible ideas was to go to Haiti and get enough of the runaway slaves in Haiti so that eventually they could come back into the southern United States and free all the slaves. And so Abraham Galloway actually goes down to Haiti and surveys the countryside and looks to see what possibilities are and stayed there for a number of weeks. And he finally gets back. When he left Boston, he was delayed in leaving Boston because he was running into problems with racism in Boston. Because they had gangs in the streets there that were burning epithets and everything else happened. So his ship was actually delayed because of racism in Boston. So it wasn't, the South had slavery, but racism was still prevalent even in the North. So after he returned from Haiti, he returned to New York rather than Boston. But about the time he got to New York, Fort Sumter happened. And so South Carolina and many of the southern states seceded from the Union, eventually North Carolina, and then I think we were next to last. Tennessee, I think, was the last southern state to secede. But eventually all the southern states seceded. And immediately, apparently Abraham Galloway had made a reputation for himself already. So he was sent to Virginia, where General Benjamin Butler, who's pictured here, he was assigned to General Butler, directly assigned to him as a spy. And General Butler, in turn, the number one mission was to capture as much as they could of northeastern North Carolina early in the war because that could be a base, a secondary base for the Union. And so General Butler assigned General Burnside to do just that, to capture northeastern North Carolina. And so Abraham was assigned to him to actually go behind enemy lines into the New Bern and Morehead City, that area. And he talked to the slaves that were more familiar with it. He's familiar with this area down here, Cape Fear, but he wasn't familiar with New Bern and Morehead City in that area. But he knew the right people to talk to, so he learned everything he could about the tides and all the entry points and such as that. So he finally passed all the information he could get. And Hatteras Inlet fell in the summer of 1861. So very early in the war, Hatteras Inlet fell, and that gave the Union access to that part of North Carolina. So eventually New Bern and Beaufort, one of the other smaller towns in that area, fell to the Union Army in early 1862. So now that area of North Carolina has been transferred to Union hands. General Butler is reassigned to New Orleans. Takes Abraham Galloway with him. Well, New Orleans was captured by the Navy. David Admiral Farragut captured New Orleans. Butler's job was to just basically govern New Orleans, keep it under Union control and manage the city. Abraham was then assigned to Colonel Albert Payne, who was from Wisconsin, and he was a very avid abolitionist. So he and Abraham got along famously. Galloway later on, or Albert Payne later on became a politician after the war and served in Congress. But their mission was to capture Vicksburg. It took Abraham Galloway with them, and as they worked their way up the river, well, they found out that Vicksburg was too well positioned right on the Mississippi River. Because the idea of the Union was that they already had control of the mouth of the Mississippi, but they wanted to capture Vicksburg because that overlooked the river and would basically give the Union total control of that river. Very important navigational point. So what the Union Army came up with was to try to divert the Mississippi River. So they actually had slaves that were in the area, and Abraham Galloway digging a canal to divert the Mississippi River. Well, they finally came to the decision that this ain't going to work. And so they withdrew, the Union withdrew. But in the process, they abandoned all the blacks that had helped them, including Abraham, and all of them were captured by the Confederate Army and made prisoners of war. Now, as I was doing this research and I came upon this point, Galloway, a year later, pops up in New Bern. And the way the book that was referencing this explains that nobody knows how he got there. And he was a spy, so they're not going to write anything down. He couldn't read and write anyhow. There's no explanation. I said, how in the world can you get this far behind enemy lines? And then it dawned on me, the book doesn't point this out, but it has to be what happened. All he has to do is, if he can get down to New Orleans, he's in Union territory, get on a Union Navy ship, come back around, go up to Beaufort, he's back in New Bern. I'm 95% sure that's probably what he did. But at any rate, he's back in New Bern. Now, we're in the point of the Civil War where it really wasn't going all that well for the North. And the Union decided they needed more recruits. And the Union, after a lot of discussion, and there was a lot of debate, and it was not all that favorable, but Congress finally approved free blacks that lived in the North could sign up and serve in the Union Army. One of the guys that helped pull together some blacks for, I think, 2 regiments was this guy on the right. That's John Andrew. He was the governor of Massachusetts. The gentleman on the left is Edward Kinsley, and he was a very wealthy man who had made his money in wool. But both of them were friends of Abraham Lincoln. And so they approached him about possibly using runaway slaves as well. So the president gave the green light. These 2 gentlemen sailed down to Huron, probably by way of Beaufort. And they thought it was going to be easy because actually early on in the time that Abraham Galloway was in Huron, a lot of the runaway slaves had come to that area, coming out of North Carolina, Virginia particularly. They head towards Huron. Well, they so wanted to put an end to this war and free the slaves that they started marching, practicing marching and carrying wooden sticks for guns. And you'd see them marching through Huron all the time until these guys got there in Huron. And they thought it was going to be easy because they actually had a recruiting center there and everything, but nobody was showing up. Well, they find out that the runaway slaves would not answer to anybody but Abraham Galloway. So they were forced to meet with Abraham. And they met in the attic of a sort of a bed and breakfast in Huron. And they were upstairs, these 2 gentlemen were upstairs, and then Abraham Galloway finally joins them. And Galloway always carried a sidearm when he was free. Well, Abraham Galloway had a lot of demands that he insisted on the Union agreeing to before he would agree to form these slave regiments. Well, some of them were kind of tough for the Union to swallow, like if captured, they would be treated by the South as prisoners of war. Well, they had no control over what the Confederates were going to do if they captured slaves. But Galloway pulls out his gun and holds it to the head of these guys till they agreed to everything that he asked for. And they went on back to Massachusetts. Abraham proceeds to organize 3 regiments of runaway slaves. They became the 1st, 2nd, 3rd North Carolina Colored Infantry, and then as they were taken into the Union Army, they were renamed the 35th, 36th, and 37th U.S. Colored Infantry. So now, next, this is one of the most amazing things to me about Abraham Galloway. Most of you, I'm sure, probably all of you know where Newbern is in relationship to us. It's about 90 miles up the road. A lot easier to get there today than it was back then. But we're getting near, we're sort of in the middle of the war, not quite at the end. And all of a sudden, Galloway decides to go to Wilmington and pull his mother out and take her back with him. Her mother lived on North 4th Street, which is the north side of the city. And he does that. He comes and gets her, takes her back from Newbern, and eventually takes her to Boston, where she spent the rest of the war. But before she went to Boston, and this is my theory again, I have to conjecture things that are not in the books and references. But what Abraham does next, he marries Martha Ann Dixon in her hometown of Beaufort. This is just a month after he came to Wilmington and got his mother. Now, people on the bet that's the reason he came to get his mother is because he wanted her at his wedding. And like I said, she eventually went home to Boston and spent the rest of the war there. But the next thing he does, there's a group of slaves, almost all of them, they're runaway slaves, Almost all of them were in North Carolina, in fact, in the Hewlett area. And Abraham Galloway got an invitation from President Lincoln. And all of them went to the White House and were met by the president. After the meeting, all these runaway slaves were just amazed at how well treated they were, that President Lincoln listened to them. One of them commented that this is the first time he'd been allowed in the front door of a house in a place he lived. But anyway, that meeting went very, very well. Abraham was trying to get some concessions out of Lincoln, because as we're getting near the end of the war, Galloway was a little bit concerned that Lincoln may be wanting to end the war and reunite the nation more so than freeing the slaves. And there's probably some reason for that concern. But that's what he met with Lincoln about. Well, after he left the White House, he went up to Syracuse, New York, because the African Americans were at the point in the war now where they were getting a little bit more confident that the Union was going to win. And so they decided they better meet and decide what they were going to do when you got a united country again. What are the slaves going to do? What are the freed slaves going to do? So they had a convention in Syracuse, and they even had violence there at that convention, because there was a lot of racial hatred in the North, as there was in the South. But in that convention, Abraham Galloway was very much involved in the convention itself. And one of the accomplishments of the convention is they formed a National Equal Rights League. And that's sort of like, I think, the NAACP might be today. That may have been the forerunner. But as soon as he got back, with the help of the AME Zion churches, chapters of the NERL were formed in Morehead City, New Bern, Little Washington, and Roanoke Island in North Carolina. So all of these areas were in Union-held territory. Now we're moved a little bit further along, and once Mobile, Alabama fell to the north, Wilmington became the only major Confederate seaport that was still open. And most of you know the story of why Wilmington was still open. A couple of Fort Fisher is such a huge fortification. Plus we had two inlets, because you see the rocks down there now. Those rocks were not there in the Civil War, so you really had two inlets. So the blockade runners could go out either one and come up and down the river. So General Grant approved a plan to capture Fort Fisher and Wilmington in order to put an end to the war. Well, in December 1864, the Union started bombarding Fort Fisher. Very heavy bombardment. And troops made a landing. And these troops were under the direction of, you guessed it, General Ben Butler. Virginia, New Orleans, back to Fort Fisher. So he seems to be always involved in Abraham Galloway's life. But he thought the fort had not been damaged enough, so he took the troops and they went back on board their ships. And it gave the Confederates a temporary victory. This was in December of 1864. So the Confederates had probably one of their last victories. And shortly after that, the first state conference of the NERL was held in New Bern, early 1865. The attendees there were so confident of the Union winning that they voted to have their next state conference in Wilmington, which was still in the Confederacy. So they felt they were getting their hopes up, and of course it worked out for them. Finally, Wilmington fell to the Union Army after the Battle of Forks Road, which, when I was growing up, I didn't know anything about the Battle of Forks Road, but I did know my friend growing up was Fred back there, the other guy with gray hair. You know, we used to run around where the mall, Independence Mall is now, it's just old pine forest. And we used to run around in that area and you could find the trenches were still there. We thought they were probably Union Army trenches, but they were actually Confederate trenches to fight the Union Army as they were towards Wilmington. But that's just a little bit further past the mall and you run into the Cameron Art Museum, which is where the Battle of Forks Road was. And as predicted by Robert E. Lee, when Wilmington fell, he said that would be the end of the Confederacy. And sure enough, 42 days later, after Wilmington fell, General Lee surrendered his troops. But let's get back to Abraham. All this was happening before fish and all that's in his home territory. But Abraham's mother, you know, he got her up to Boston to ride out the rest of the war after he had her there for his wedding. As soon as that war was over, Abraham's mother and her now legal in the South husband, Amos, returned to Wilmington. And they lived on North 4th Street, directly across the street from where her previous owner was living. And Abraham and his wife, Martha Ann, also moved back to Wilmington and moved in with his mother on 4th Street. And Abraham and his wife joined the congregation at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, which was an interracial church. Don't think about that soon after the Civil War, but before 1898 occurred, and you hear a lot about 1898, Wilmington was a good example of how a southern city should handle things. There was actually the population was about 50-50 blacks and whites. Everybody was happy. Blacks were craftsmen. Most of them were artisans, and they had their own businesses, and they were all doing very, very well. And North and Orange Street, some of these, as I run across these addresses, if they're in Wilmington, I'll go look at them today. 4th and Orange Street, there is no church there anymore. It's, I haven't done the research on it yet, but that's a block. I think that may have been taken over by the I think there was a cemetery of the Episcopal Church. Fire department had a station there for a while. It's all gone. But now that the war is over, North Carolina has some work to do. Because we could not rejoin the Union without developing a new constitution first. Well, in September 1867, Abraham Galloway delivered the opening address at the founding convention of the North Carolina Republican Party. And then he was nominated by the Republican Party to campaign for state senate in the first election in North Carolina where blacks were allowed to vote. He got elected, even though there was a lot of work to keep blacks away from the polls. But in 1868, he was elected a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in Raleigh. So he was a very, very busy guy. Once he got stowed away on that schooner, he stayed active. So he's back in Wilmington, the war's over, and now he's helping to get the state constitution written. And he's working very hard to get civil rights for the blacks, but he also was one of the leaders in trying to get voting rights for women of all colors, because whites could not vote. And he was moderately successful in getting most of his demands included in the state constitution. And to wrap it up, on September 1st, 1870, he was 33 years old. He died of an apparent heart attack after being reelected. Just been reelected and not even going back up to Raleigh. But he reelected as a state senator. and died of a heart attack. And at the time of his, a lot of people thought that, like David Walker, both of them, some people thought they may have been assassinated. David Walker, I think, probably was. But Abraham's wife, after visiting her folks in Beaufort at the time that he had his heart attack, but she is the one that said that he did have heart trouble. And so it's based on her feelings that it could be that he really did have a heart attack. At his funeral, this gives you an indication of how well he was respected by blacks and whites. He was probably hated by a lot of blacks, but he was respected by a lot too. 6,000 mourners, the largest in North Carolina's history, up to today. 6,000 people came to his funeral. Women, blacks and whites. He buried us at the gates of the Pine Forest Cemetery. Those of you that are not familiar with Pine Forest is right, I guess it'd be east of the Oakdale Cemetery. They have a common border. Pine Forest land was purchased by the city of Wilmington, I think before the Civil War. 4 blacks buried him. It's I don't think the city owns it now. I think it's run primarily by a board, but it requires, it needs a lot of work. There are volunteers that help, but it still needs a lot of help. So I'm a Duke Power retiree, and I get a newsletter from them. They just, the last newsletter, they were supporting an effort to clean up and repair a black cemetery in Raleigh that supposedly had historical people in it. I guarantee there's not as many historical people in Raleigh as there are in that cemetery. And so I will be working a little bit if I can to see if we can get Duke to help out with Pine Forest. But he was laid rest in Pine Forest Cemetery, and unfortunately, that's not the end of the story. And this is, as a native Wilmingtonian, this is the embarrassing part. We don't know where he is. Someone stole his headstone, possibly even stole his body. We don't know. But that's one of the things that Duke was doing at Raleigh Cemetery. They're doing some underground investigating, but they'll be able to find the bodies. And it has the potential to be as beautiful as Oakdale. It's in the same area, but its headstones are pushed over, probably by vandals. So I'd like to make a pitch for them, but they need work and they need help. And most of the information that I've obtained is from the book, The Fire of Freedom, Abraham Galloway and the Slave Civil War. It's written by David Southport. You can probably pronounce his name better than I can. It's a Southport.
It's a Southport.
That's a very, very good book.
Anything like this.
Yeah. And he's from Eastern North Carolina. He's not from Wilmington, I don't think. But, as a side, I think it was last year or the year before, there's a one-man show about Abraham Galloway. And it's based on this book. And that one-man show was at Pelion Hall last year. It's within the last couple of years, and my daughter bought me tickets for it. She knew I was interested in it. And the author was there, the screenwriter, or what do you call the guy that converts it to a play?
Yeah.
Was there. So after the play, all 3 of them, the actor and these 2 were up on the stage, and they just opened up questions. And there's a good audience there, and a lot of African Americans. I'm so proud to see them there. And so they had a long period of time where you could ask questions about Abraham Galloway and his life. And, I hope I've conveyed a little bit of information to you that maybe you didn't know when you first came in. But if anybody has any questions, I'll try to answer them. And before I do that, I'd like to recognize Pauline Hankins. She came in fact. She is the chairman of the Brunswick County African American Heritage Commission. She's a district judge from Brunswick County. And I finally got to meet her. I talked to her on the phone in Zoom meetings with her, but she made it up here to join us today. Anyone have any questions?
This isn't about Abraham Galloway. There's Althea Gibson on your list of people.
Absolutely. Growing up, there were a lot of heroes that I had. And tennis was one of my sports. Baseball was my favorite. But I admire her because of the tennis collection. And
She has ties to him.
absolutely, she went to Williston High School.
Yeah.
Another one that's on my list is Percy Heath, who started this. I forgot the name of this group, but it's jazz. His whole family was musical. And he was the oldest. Doing my research, I found out he's a Tuskegee Airman too.
Oh, wow.
Most of his siblings and him too are deceased, but he had one brother that's still alive. He may still be alive. I found him online in an interview. He was out in California and he was interviewed. He actually talked about his family had moved to Philadelphia. But Percy himself was the oldest. He got to go to Williston. And he said that Williston, by far, was the better school than what they had in Philadelphia. And anyway, yes, sir.
And did Galloway have any dealings with Frederick Douglass?
I read where it's rumored, I didn't see any proof of it, but Frederick Douglass and Abraham occasionally were on the same playbill. And whenever that occurred, Frederick Douglass introduced Abraham Galloway. That's right. And Douglass is known for being an excellent speaker. Galloway never learned to read and write. He became a state senator and apparently must have been an excellent speaker.
Well, we enjoyed the presentation you did today.
Yes.
Very.
Les, you said he died at 32, is that what you said?
32 or 33.
That's amazing, that I have a heart attack. But he did have a history of some heart. I wonder if it was, his family may have died, and blacks often die.
Well, if you think our diets are dead today, I imagine there's a report,
Right.
especially in the South.
Did his wife survive much longer?
I understand there's still some of his descendants around, so apparently she did. And I don't remember when she died. But, there's a road in Brunswick County, if I'm not mistaken, that's named after him. Galloway Road, and it's somewhere near Bolivia, isn't it?
It's in Bolivia.
But to me, he's just an amazing, accomplished guy. Anything else?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Hewlett, for this informative talk. I learned a lot and this was wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today. Let's give him a round of applause. For future program information, please check out our library calendar on the website, or you can visit our adult programming table on the first floor of this building. Thank you all for being here today. We really appreciate your attendance here at the library. And again, thank you, Mr. Hewlett. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.